unfortunately. But we are working.
So, well, I hope y'all are safe.
We're trying.
Good morning, everybody. Since it's 10 o'clock, I'm going to get us started. My name is Laura Brewer. I work for Attorney General Stein, and I want to thank you all for being here and working with me on the technology and the plans for today. I appreciate it. Just a couple ground rules to get us started. Those of you who are speaking will have about 3 minutes to address the task force. And then unfortunately, because there's a lot of people and a lot to discuss, we'll have to move on to the next person. You'll get a warning and then you'll be muted. I also wanted to mention the chat box to you. If there are things that you want to add to the conversation and you're not able to get in, please feel free to put that in the chat box and include your email address so we can follow up on it. We will be saving those and using them. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that we have a website for the task force at ncdoj.gov/TREC. There you can file formal comments and also learn more about the task force work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Attorney General Stein.
Laura, thank you for setting the stage this morning. Thank you for all your hard work pulling together. This is our sixth one of these regional roundtables in the last week. It was a big lift. And so I really do want to thank you. Really very helpful. These discussions have been immensely helpful to Justice Earls and me and many members of our task force, which are on, a lot of people from the task force are actually in the attendees observing our discussion with the panelists today. This whole effort has arisen based on this national reckoning on race and the criminal justice system. The horrendous video of Mr. Floyd being his life extinguished at the knee of an officer, and then the resulting public protests that followed have really reshaped, I think, the public understanding of the inequities of race in our criminal justice system, but also, I think, race throughout our country and our society. And so this is not new for most Black people. I think for a lot of white people, it has been a rude awakening, but a very necessary one. So Governor Cooper created this task force asking Justice Earls, me, and the members of the task force to wrestle and advance the discussion. You know, the words chiseled on the face of the Supreme Court are equal justice under law. And we don't have that right now. At every stage of the criminal justice process, from that first interaction to arrest, to pretrial detention, to plea bargaining and trials and convictions and sentencing and punishment in prison and reentry, at every stage, African Americans fare worse, and that's not acceptable. And so we need to grapple with that. We need to change that. We need to fix that. And so that's our charge. It's not only to identify good ideas, but to see that they get implemented. And we're taking it seriously. We as a task force have met twice, and in the second meeting, we adopted 3 recommendations: a ban on chokeholds, a duty to intervene and report, and a recommendation to the Supreme Court to direct judges to consider a defendant's ability to pay before instituting a fine or fee so we don't criminalize poverty. Those are just 3 preliminary recommendations. These were ones where we had broad consensus from the very beginning from the entire task force, but we are going to do much, much more than that. Our report is due in December, and we are working exceptionally diligently. We've met as a full task force twice. We've broken our work into 4 separate working groups, 2 of them on the law enforcement side, and 2 of them on the courts and beyond side. And that's actually how we're going to structure our discussion today. The first half, we'll talk about the police, things like use of force, culture, training, accountability, recruitment, the key ways we can make law enforcement work better for communities. And then we'll talk about the courts and the issues that they confront. And I will lead the discussion on the first half, and Justice Earls will take the lead on the second half of our discussion. And at this point, I'd like to hand it off to Justice Earls so she can also offer preliminary words of greeting.
Yes, thank you, Attorney General Stein, and good morning, everyone. I truly do appreciate you spending time with us this morning. Your input really is crucial for us. Part of the reason for having these listening sessions is so that we can have a little more in-depth back and forth. We are having public hearings, but this is an opportunity to actually engage in some dialogue. It's also really valuable to be able to hear more specifically what's happening in your community. We know this is a big state. There are rural urban differences. What happens in Asheville is not the same as what happens in Wilmington. So this is really our opportunity to hear what you see as the crucial issues in your community. I want to make clear the governor's thought behind instituting this task force was to truly have data-based solutions that work, that will make a difference. So we are not about change just for change's sake. So hearing from you, not only about what the issues are, but what do you see as solutions that will make a difference is really crucial. And I would also say we're not about just recommending that we keep doing what we are doing. In some places, there are some innovative programs that are having an impact, and we might want to recommend expansion of those. And certainly, we want to identify what are causing the problems, but there is an underlying assumption that this is an issue that we need to do things differently in order to impact. And just, to be crystal clear, the mission of the task force, it's to develop and help implement. So the first 6 months we're making recommendations. The next year and a half, we are working to foster the implementation of those solutions. But these are solutions that will eliminate disparate outcomes in the criminal justice system for communities of color. So that is a huge mandate, but at the same time, we have all of you, and you really are crucial to the process, because we can't just wave our hands and make all this happen. It's really what's going to happen at the local level. It's your commitment to identifying what needs to be done and then helping to make it happen that's going to make the difference. So I hope that this will continue a partnership, and I'm really anxious and eager, as I know all the task force members who are listening are, to hear from you. So I'll turn it back to Attorney General Stein.
Thank you, Justice Earls. So we'll start the conversation talking about law enforcement, and a critical element of law enforcement success is to have trust. There has to be trust between law enforcement and the community for it to work well. And there are ways you can build that trust. That's a lot of what we want to talk about today. I'd like to start with Judge Ashley Dunstan. And if you could just offer some preliminary general remarks on the issue of law enforcement and what you think we're getting right and what we need to work on.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for seeing me first. I have to start divorces at 10:30, so I'm going to have to hop off here in a second. But good morning, everyone. Good morning, Justice Earls. Good morning, Attorney General Stein, and everyone else on the task force. I see a lot of friends on here that are in the fight, so just thank you again for the opportunity. I do have some thoughts on that, but if you don't mind, in my little bit of time, I would love to talk about just in general what I think that some things that the task force should take into consideration. Really from just the judiciary standpoint, if you're okay with that, Attorney General Stein, is that okay? Okay. All right. So you nodding. Okay. Got the thumbs up. All right. So really quick, I think one of the main things that we need to talk about is bias and implicit bias. That is something that I've been advocating for and will continue to advocate for, because when we talk about individuals on the bench and in robes, this is where justice is exemplified and seen. We are, the justice system is not an arm of police. The DA's office, as a former prosecutor and as a former assistant attorney general, I understand both sides of that and understand that, the justice system is not an arm of anything. But the judiciary is where it is happening. This is what people are seeing. This is what people are understanding, and in the legal profession in general. I think that the task force, it would be helpful for the task force to look into mandatory bias training for all judicial officials, as well as for all attorneys. I am also advocating with the Ethics Committee for the North Carolina State Bar for Rule 1.1, which would make it mandatory for CLE training as just a part of competency for attorneys to receive bias training either annually or biannually or every 3 years, some type of racism bias training for lawyers to make sure that that is something that all individuals are educated about, is their biases. I also think this is, like I said, important for the judiciary as well. Also, Rule 8, ABA Model Rule 8.4G for attorneys, rules of misconduct to engage in discrimination in the practice of law. I think it's also an important rule that the Ethics Committee is taking under and looking at, and I think that the task force should be supportive in that as well, in that effort to ensure that no attorney that is practicing, whether you're representing someone or not, is engaging in discrimination. As attorneys, we are held to a higher standard, and I think that that is extremely important when we talk about the trust of the judicial system and the justice system. I think that's extremely important. I also think that, as Justice Earls talked about, we need consistency across the state of North Carolina. Although I am a district court judge here in Wake County, and we do have a lot of resources, there are still a lot of things that are lacking for Black and Brown communities, such as the educational piece of what's happening, feeling as though they are being heard in situations, and also understanding the holistic piece and the collateral consequences that occur from charges being filed, expunsions being done. I am one of the expunction judges, and that process is challenging for individuals to understand as well. So it's hard to ensure, and legal aid only has but so many resources to help people. But clinics, driver's license restoration, right? When we have individuals that are being charged and are not being able to have those fines remitted. We know that African Americans are pulled over at substantial levels, right? So then at that point, they're also impoverished. So they're not able to pay these fines. So now we're looking at a situation where somebody is continuing to drive over and over again. The fines are compounding. Now they're not able to work. And so, and then they have DMV ramifications. So we really need to look at those collateral consequences and what that looks like, and whether we need to begin remitting some of these fines to ensure that we are assisting. And that needs to be done consistently across the state. Like I said, I'm from Hickory, North Carolina. I don't know if I said that, but I am from Hickory, North Carolina. And so when I'm looking at Wake County and I'm looking at my home county of Catawba County, I know there's a lot of discrepancies in there. So we really need to get that consistent to make sure that it doesn't matter what county you live in, that you are getting the same resources and the same justice system is applying to you across the board. And finally, the last thing that I would say is that we need more discretion in sentencing for judges. When we look at sentencing guidelines that are mandatory, we really need to make sure that the resources, like I said, are available. When I look at someone in front of me, I understand that there is not always, a fine is not always appropriate. Jail time is not always appropriate, and probation is not always appropriate. So there are instances where I really want to be able to help someone, but the question is, what are the resources available? And we really need to ensure that mental health resources are available. When we look at substance abuse, it occurs as a Band-Aid for mental health, but people can't afford it if they don't have health insurance necessarily. And TASC is a wonderful thing that I can offer through probation, but it's also difficult to get there. I mean, it's at least 2 miles away from the courthouse, and people are having to take bus routes and not able to get there. I see Dawn shaking her head. Yeah. So, I mean, we're very limited. I'm just like, what can I do? I'm spinning my wheels and trying to make sure that I'm helping people to prevent recidivism. I apologize for that. To prevent recidivism. But we definitely need to do more on that aspect. So those are my quick thoughts. Would be more than happy to talk about that more in depth later if you ever want to call me back. But thank you so much for the time. I truly appreciate everything that you all are doing.
Judge, thank you for sharing your experience and ideas, and they will certainly advance our work. I want to move to Ricky Leung to talk about law enforcement use of force. He's with the Durham People's Alliance. Ricky?
Hi, thank you so much, Attorney General Stein. My name is Ricky Leung, and I'm here on behalf of the People's Alliance in Durham in capacity as a board member there. I'd like to begin by honoring and remembering some of the victims of police violence in Durham over the past few years. Derek Walker, Jose Ocampo, Levante Biggs, Chuis Huerta, Carlos Riley Jr., Stephanie Nickerson. At the PA, we encourage an invest-divest framework, invest in alternative solutions of community safety led by local communities, and divest from dependency on and funding for police and its militarization, investing in people, as mentioned before, through things like affordable housing, accessible healthcare that includes mental health, $15 an hour minimum wage, enacting policies like eviction diversion, supporting and investing in reentry for justice-involved people through driver's license restoration expungement, eliminating cash bail, fines, and fees because they perpetuate a cycle of criminalizing poverty and homelessness, and disproportionately affect and lead to the criminalization of people of lower income, particularly in Black communities and other communities of color. These are some recommendations uplifted in a report produced in 2019 by the Durham Beyond Policing Coalition, which I encourage the task force to review if you haven't already done so. The report also explains how community policing doesn't work, and the presence of police in the community doesn't make people feel safe. And that's true for Black communities, Latino communities, and other immigrant communities as well. Body cameras also don't work on its own as an accountability measure, especially if the footage is not public record. The 2019 Durham Beyond Policing report proposes a funded and empowered community-led safety and wellness task force, offering specific community-centered examples and solutions as alternatives to policing. And these examples come from locally in Durham, led by folks likely represented by others who will also speak today, like Spirit House, Song, NC Community Bail Fund, BYP 100, to examples from cities across the nation. In 2013, thanks to the work of the FADE Coalition, Durham adopted a written consent search policy to reduce racial disparity in traffic stops and searches, and more work is needed to make marijuana a low-level enforcement priority. Right now, it's also important to consider compassionate release of incarcerated people. Just 4 days ago, it was reported in the NNO that 8 incarcerated people were tested positive for COVID-19 at the Durham County Jail. As far as the use of force, in addition to the elimination of chokeholds, the task force should also recommend banning prone restraint, as occurred in Mr. Neville's death at the Forsyth County Jail, was reported in news a couple days ago. Prone restraint is recognized as a lethal hold and is already banned in psych hospitals by NCDHHS. The Durham Human Relations Commission also made some published recommendations regarding detention facilities that would be helpful for the task force to peruse. And lastly, I think our local law enforcement across the state should absolutely not enter into 287G agreements with ICE, and we should vigilantly and actively oppose to any unlawful detention of our immigrant community members, including preventing the spread of warrant service officer programs across the state.
Ricky, thank you. I think you get the award for the most content in your 3 minutes. That was exceptionally helpful. And you referred to a number of documents, and we've got some team members, staff team on the call. And to the extent we don't have those materials, they'll follow up with you to get them if that's okay. Appreciate those comments. Dawn Blagrove, I'd like to hear your thoughts on police accountability and other relevant topics to our discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the first thing that we have to talk about in the foundation of this conversation is trust. And there is, as we have seen from protests across the country, a breach of trust between the Black community and law enforcement. There are a number of ways that we could try to address that we have tried before, but I think it is an exercise of futility and, quite frankly, performative to continue to do what we've already been doing. That doesn't work. I would offer that the way we get to transparency one way and accountability, especially in North Carolina, is to do a massive review of 168-168. One of the best ways to get to trust is transparency. Right now, the public is not allowed to see the disciplinary records of law enforcement officers. While I understand the inherent need for some public officials to be protected, some city employees to be protected because of unfair or targeted retaliatory actions by the public, possibly, I think law enforcement should be absolutely carved out from that exception, for the very reason that they have a license to kill and to carry guns. And because of that, they should be held to a much higher level of scrutiny from the public, and the public should have access to any and all disciplinary records that relate to law enforcement officers who are trusted with keeping our communities safe. Now, that is my first recommendation, but my ultimate recommendation is that we do a significant divestment from law enforcement and invest in the community. I think statistically what we know and research bears out is number one, that law enforcement does not reduce crime, that police officers spend the vast majority of their time working on things that have nothing to do with law enforcement or crime prevention. I suspect that we could, and I don't only suspect, I think evidence bears out from other programs that we've seen across the country, that when you invest those programs or invest those funds with programs that have employees who are trained and skilled to address the issues and social needs of your communities, what you find is that you do not need as much law enforcement, and ultimately the people are helped in a way that is preventative as opposed to reactionary. I think a perfect example of this is a proposal that was just recently made in Raleigh, where large amounts of money are being proposed to go into the Raleigh Police Department to create a homeless and mental health agency within law enforcement. I would offer that that is absolutely the wrong direction. It is absolutely reinvestment and further doubling down on policies and programs that do not work. There are dozens of homeless programs, dozens of mental health programs with people who are trained and dedicated and committed to addressing those issues. Having that money allocated to the police department is nonsensical, and it's not a fiduciary investment that we would make in any other avenue of government or our lives. We need to think very critically about what we are asking law enforcement to do and what they are capable of doing. What we know for sure is that they are incapable of policing themselves. They are incapable of being objective about evaluating each other's performances. I would highly recommend that this committee, the task force, suggest creating an objective and independent body that is dedicated solely to policing the police. That should be funded completely by internal affairs departments, that should be removed exclusively from all police departments and all law enforcement agencies across the state. The police have shown us time and time again, they are incapable of policing themselves. If we remove money, defund internal affairs completely, take those fundings and put them into an independent agency, something similar to what we have for North Carolina Prisoners Legal Services, we would get a much better outcome and create much more trust. So again, transparency is necessary to build trust. In order to create transparency, we need massive changes to 160A-168, which I believe as a lawyer is being erroneously interpreted by city managers and city attorneys all over this state. The case law says that you cannot release that information to the public. However,
I'm so sorry I have to interrupt, but we're right at your time limit.
Okay, well, thank you.
Dawn, thank you very much for your ideas and thoughts. The United States is the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have a healthcare system available to all of its citizens. And we're one of a dozen states in the country that has refused to expand Medicaid. So we have 10% of this state has no health insurance. So when people have mental health crises, when people have substance use issues, we don't have a healthcare system where they can go to get treated and get well. And so it falls upon law enforcement to be essentially the catchment system for all of our society's problems. And we spend hundreds of hours training law enforcement to be peace officers, but then we're also asking them to be mental health counselors and drug counselors and social workers. You know, we had a call in Greenville yesterday. The sheriff was saying how they get calls from mothers who can't get their children out of bed to go to school. And the mother may need help, but is law enforcement the right organization to call? We don't have a social work system that can help those people. So I definitely hear what you're saying in that regard, Dawn. Thank you. Lisa Yaboa, who is pastor of Southeast Raleigh Table, why don't you share your thoughts on law enforcement and equity in law enforcement, please?
Yeah, so my name is Reverend Lisa Yaboa, and I'm coming to this conversation wearing two hats this morning. One, as a pastor who is quite observant when it comes to human beings and what it means for them to be their best and most just selves. Also, as a pastor, I really believe that language matters and how we anchor ourselves and how we're shaped by language. The second is that I'm a neighbor and live in College Park, which is a historically Black neighborhood in Southeast Raleigh. And by all accounts, people would say that my neighborhood is over-policed. I'm a person who walks my dog and every single morning and has never gotten a wave from another police officer who's driven by. I sit on my porch and I watch traffic stops with 6 SUVs surrounding a car. So that's how I come. With my eyes on people trying to be their best selves and also wanting the city that I live in to be her very best self as well. And so here are the things that I just want to share that kind of bubbled up when I was invited to offer up some concerns, is that I think whenever we talk about reform in regards to law enforcement and our kind of legislative system, I oftentimes think that we don't start the story correctly because we don't know how to anchor the story in regards to how every single system in the United States of America has been baptized in white supremacy. And so even when we talk about policing and law enforcement, we forget about it. It doesn't just oh, oops, George Floyd, but convict leasing, and that police were actually set up to keep peace, not make peace. And so I think for kind of as Don was saying, I think just in regards to trust and transparency, let's tell the story correctly. Because if we tell the story correctly, then we can redeem the story correctly. But if we don't tell the story correctly, we're not going to be able to repair if we don't connect and then also correct the dots. The second is that as I think about how we sometimes talk about law enforcement and police as though they're somehow beyond humanity, and because we do that, we make this dangerous assumption that police officers also don't have trauma, wounds, insecurities, blind spots, spiritual blind spots, as they operate in their vocation and also in their work. And so as we also talk about training, I also want to know, how are we helping people see what they cannot see within themselves, and not just as they are being prepared to be a part of law enforcement, but throughout their careers. I had a therapist in 2010. I have a therapist now. Why? Because I've not arrived. And I think we need to remember the humanity of people. However, because I'm not in a symbiotic relationship when I'm in the presence of a law enforcement officer, because they do have a gun, a taser, or the right to maybe even take me into custody, if they cannot see the things that they cannot see, it means life or death for me. And so I think we need to take very seriously the traumas that people have because we're people, and because we're people, we're not perfect. The last thing that I just want to share is when I was moving into College Park, I was told that my neighborhood had a community policing, was a neighborhood that had community policing. And I just want to offer this one-liner. Proximity does not make for intimacy. Just because I see lots of police officers in my neighborhood, I see dozens of them, does not make for intimacy. Just because people drive around doesn't automatically create relationship. Can I just tell you that in the 5 years that I've lived on Pettigrew, I live across the street from the bus stop, and I go see the kids, the high schoolers, the middle schoolers, and the elementary school kids. I have never seen a police officer. I've seen lots of police officers drive by the kids, never get out and actually say hello to the kids. Not on the first day of school, not on the last day of school, not in the middle of the school year. I have never had a conversation with a police officer in my community, except for when I've had to call someone for some random issue. I walk my dog every single morning. And I live by a community center that's supposed to have kind of a community policing office. And so it is not rare for me to see or to be passed by a police officer at least 12 times in 1 week. And I have never, ever had a conversation with a police officer in my community. And so what I'm wondering is, do people look past my humanity or do they understand my humanity? And when police are in my community, are they looking for problems or are they looking to develop relationships with people? And so if people feel as though they're being looked past or only looked at whenever they are problematic, then that does deteriorate any level of a means of having real relationship. So it doesn't mean that I don't believe in community policing. I just want our aspirations for community policing to actually match what's happening. So as this hat of a person who wants people to be their very best selves, and as a person who lives in a community who wants to believe that people come to protect and to serve and to be in relationship with me, I would ask us to believe more of ourselves than too little of ourselves.
Thank you, Reverend Yeboah. Yeah, if you look at the mental health indicators, law enforcement suffers more than almost any other profession. PTSD, and I think it comes from all that we put on their shoulders, that we just expect too much. But it's also important that we recruit and we train them properly. And I'd like to turn now to Sheriff Burkhead and Chief Deck Brown to talk about those issues, about how do you recruit the right person into your departments, the person who sees their job as a peace officer, as a guardian, somebody who protects the public, as opposed to more of the warrior who wants to kind of break down doors and then ask questions later. I'll start with you, Sheriff, if we can, Sheriff Burkhead, and then come back to you, Chief Brown.
Thank you, Attorney General, and good morning to everyone. Great conversation, and your question is very appropriate, particularly in this space that we're in. I think every CEO, sheriff, chief of police across the country is struggling with that balance of moving from the warrior mentality more to the guardian mentality. And we as law enforcement have been struggling with that for years because we are asked, as you mentioned earlier, asked to do so many things that are not really incumbent upon law enforcement. It really is incumbent upon the community. But here at Durham County Sheriff's Office, we strive to recruit members that represent the community. And I think that's the first thing that we have to do. We have to have an agency that is reflective of the population that we serve. So we're pushing to recruit more Black and Brown, Latinx members of the community. So we can have that sort of melting pot approach and understand different aspects of culture and community within the organization. And then certainly training, working with the Justice Academy and the Sheriff's Training Academy, we're looking at different ways to move beyond cultural sensitivity training. We've been doing that for years. It's not working. So we're looking at different aspects of training. It was mentioned earlier about implicit bias, bias training. So all of those are on the table, but I think it goes much further than that. I think it starts at the top. And there are some on this call who have heard me say this before. We have to be responsible for policing our agencies. When I ran for sheriff and was elected, I ran on the platform of T, transparency, engagement, and accountability. It starts at the top. To Reverend Yarborough, I don't want to mess it up, but community policing is not a program. In 1990, when I was at another agency and we were talking about a program called community policing, after doing all my research, it is not a program, it's a philosophy. And the philosophy starts at the top and then it permeates its way throughout the organization, where deputies and officers understand that it's their responsibility to build relationships in communities, to drive by the corner store and stop and get out, to see someone out walking the dog, as you mentioned, and have a conversation with them, or at least acknowledge their presence. It's a shift in the way we've been trained to ride around with these blinders on. So community policing, I think, is a good program or a good philosophy that we need to continue to implement. But as a sheriff or a chief, we have to hold our officers accountable to do that. How do we measure that? We've always struggled with that. But we also have to walk that walk ourselves. So I'm out in the community, and I know Chief Deck Brown and my Chief Davis here in Durham are out in the community exemplifying what we expect our officers to do. And then when bad things happen, we have to hold them accountable. Far too long, chiefs of police all across the country, police unions have not held officers accountable for their criminal activity. And that's exactly what it is. George Floyd was not the first, it will not be the last, but we have to hold these officers accountable when they break the law or when they violate policy or when their uniform is messed up. We have to, again, it was mentioned earlier, hold officers to a higher standard. Absolutely. And that's up to the sheriff, that's up to the chief to set that bar high. And then hopefully the community will get in line with us and hold us accountable as we too hold the community accountable. This is an issue that is going to take all of us to solve. My ultimate goal is to create a community that is less dependent on law enforcement and more empowered and can basically police themselves, fend for themselves, and that we are there to support the community. And that's been my goal here at the Durham County Sheriff's Office and in other agencies. And I think that message is working for us in Durham. I'll give a shout out to Durham. We have not had the protests that other cities across the state and across the country have had. We have not had the vandalism. We've not had the looting. And I think that is a testament to the work that Chief Davis and I are doing in our community. And that's the model for us. And we're going to continue to push that forward, building those relationships.
Sure. Thank you very much for those comments. Chief Tech Brown.
Good morning, Justice Earls, Attorney General Stein, and everyone else on the call. Obviously, there were several points, and I know I've got a limited amount of time by which to speak. I do want to piggyback on a few things that the sheriff referenced. And when we talk about training, I think you have to also take a much broader assessment of resources within specific departments. You know, just nationally, we have about 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. And half of those agencies have less than 25 officers. So you are talking about large departments and you're talking about very small Mayberry type departments. And from one end of that spectrum to the other lies training. And that training very often is dictated by the resources that are available to those agencies. Obviously, here in the state of North Carolina, we are held to a standard of training that is dispensed across the state, but that's minimal training. And then it is incumbent upon the agencies to identify what other training and opportunities for training that are needed and are afforded to their respective agency given the resources. That is challenging for small agencies. And when you layer on, for whatever reasons, defunding organizations, you diminish those other opportunities for training. What I also think we have to look very closely at as well is, and I think you all mentioned this at the onset of the introduction and the greeting, is what is science-based? What is data-based? As you look at what is needed and afforded. As we look across the country, and Raleigh has had its share of officer-involved incidents as well. However, it doesn't necessarily dictate that is a reason for something else placed on that agency without having an understanding, one, of what use of force looks like across the state. What are the trends? What are the patterns? What is going on within that agency? We don't have a database within our state. We don't have one across the country. And so when we look at training, what comes out of some of that data and the science is there may be a pattern. There could be a training flaw. There could be something that we are teaching that may not be the right thing. I'm not saying that is the case, but if we don't have anything that supports what this chief or this sheriff chooses to educate his or her officers on, versus what another one has, then they are really relying on what is mandated by the state and what resources at minimal are afforded. Raleigh, some of the larger sheriff's offices and departments, I think, are in a better position to allow and create other opportunities, not just what is mandated, but then you're able to bring people inside of your agency, contract with consultants and so forth, and or send folk away for additional training as well. When you don't have those resources, that is not necessarily afforded. I know that there were other comments made, and I do think the points that were made as it relates to services that are provided. When we don't have the necessary services within our communities to stand in those gaps, at 3 o'clock in the morning, no one else is calling anybody but law enforcement. So when you talk about social services concerns, and we have seen this systemically over the course of time across the country. Police chiefs have said, law enforcement leaders have said for years, police officers, law enforcement officers are wearing more and more hats. And they continue to be placed on us when we find that there are fewer beds in mental health facilities, when mental health facilities are no longer existent, when we see diminishing resources for our homeless community. And in light of events like COVID, we really saw concerns as it related to our homeless community. When you see an executive order where everyone has to shelter at home, where are the homeless to go? They're on the streets, and they're on the streets. So now you see the trees in the midst of the forest because nobody else is on the street with them. And the resources, restaurants are closed, restrooms are closed, and the list goes on. So you are finding agencies and law enforcement standing in those gaps and providing social services assistance in ways that we have had to do in the past, but are finding the need to render those services even more. Trust me, we would gladly.
So sorry to interrupt, but you're right over your time.
Thank you.
Very helpful context, Chief Deck Brown. Thank you. We also have Burlington Chief of Police Jeff Smythe with us. Chief Smythe, I didn't know if you wanted to offer a thought on this issue.
Yeah, happy to. Just very briefly, I think that, well, first, I was unaware of this group's work, and then I got the email yesterday that said the first 2 steps were this, and I didn't know they were the first 2 steps of a much bigger plan, and I reacted poorly. And I thought to myself, that's it? That's what we're going to do to fix this? And I was like, no way, that can't be it, right? And I reached out to Seth, and Seth put me on the call. So my feedback for the group would be that I think that we can have the best intentions, but unless we have a system to either compel or encourage all of the agencies in North Carolina to participate in a meaningful way, we're missing the mark, right? We've got 400 plus municipalities, 100 sheriff's offices. The big agencies like Raleigh, right? They've got a robust internal affairs unit. They've got the spotlight on them. The place where I think we're not hearing the stories from small and rural agencies that might not have good leaders and might not have quality programs. And so whether we use a state level accreditation program or mandatory training for the police chiefs, there's got to be ways that we reach down into the roots of police organizations across the state to bring meaningful change to policing in North Carolina. So that's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We have the mayors from the 2 large cities in the Triangle, Raleigh Mayor Marianne Baldwin and Durham Mayor Steve Schul. And you all have to kind of walk this line between the community and the police departments that you oversee. Start with you, Mayor Baldwin. What are your thoughts on this discussion?
So thank you, Attorney General Stein, Justice Earls, and hello, Mayor Schul. At one point, he and I were spending way too much time talking to each other. So, but I've really enjoyed our relationship and the way that we're working together. So just a couple of thoughts. some of the things that we have done as a city, we adopted the 8 Can't Wait, which addresses chokeholds, and also the Good Samaritan rules. We did establish a police advisory board that will look at policy and building trust. One of the issues that we have is that our police advisory boards throughout the state have limited abilities, and we have written a letter to, which you all should have received, asking you to look at how we can build some consistency and transparency, and also giving communities what they need or what they feel they need to address issues. We're also looking at new ways of providing public safety. Our police chief is going to have an announcement on that on Tuesday related to a new mental health and homelessness unit, which will be comprised of social workers. Really very excited about that. I agree and concur with everything the chief said about training. We have resources, but even our resources are limited. Oh, that's the train. Sorry. But how can we do that more equitably as well across the state? And one thing we are doing is an internal and external reviews of the police department and our performance during the protest. We're also having somebody looking at our use of force policies and also providing us with information on how to be more innovative in providing public safety. I think one of the things that I think is more important is the policing is one thing, and we've asked police to be everything, just like our school teachers. But what we're not talking about is the issue of poverty and the lack of equity in education and healthcare, access to healthy food, housing affordability, the lack of opportunity. All of this is really about systemic racism, which also ties into policing. We've also had, with COVID, we really shined a light on the issues and the lack of support for our homeless community. You know, I've said this for a while, we created Oak City Cares, and I think everybody was kind of patting themselves on the back. And I was like, no, this is just the start of what we need to do to address getting our homeless community the social services and the assistance they need. On a statewide level, we need to address gun violence. I mean, that is also tearing apart our minority communities. We have to address bail reform. I think Ricky had mentioned marijuana arrest that impacts our young African-American community and creates criminals when for very low level incidents.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're right at 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor, thanks very much. Mayor Schul.
Thanks a lot for inviting me, and it's been great to hear all the everything that's been said so far. It's been a great discussion. I'm really grateful to be a part of it and to see so many great people on the call, and good to see Mayor Baldwin as well. So just a few things that I think are really important. One is I do think that some of the things that are holding us back really can be changed at the state level. Decriminalizing marijuana, having a body cam law that is different than the one that we have. We have the restrictions that the city council has on us now. We can't even release body camera footage without the Superior Court judge's approval. That needs to be changed. We need the Second Chance Act, which was a great accomplishment, to be retroactive. We need the things that are provided going forward with the Second Chance Act in terms of expunction to be made retroactive. In Durham, we have the DEAR program, and this is works on both expunctions as well as driver's license restoration. And DA DeBerry is here on the call with us, has been instrumental an instrumental partner in this. But this has been very, very successful for us. We've remitted over $2 million in fines and fees. We have helped up to 7,000 people be prepared to get their driver's license back. Over 50,000 charges dropped. The average age of these charges is 16 years. And so we need a change in state law so that that there's not an indefinite suspension for not paying a traffic ticket. We also need a change in state law that would give amnesty periods where the DMV fees are waived. These are the kinds of things that could really, these are justice system changes that could really help us. We need to abolish the death penalty. The death penalty in North Carolina is persisted way too long. We know that our state does not favor the death penalty. We know what's happening in the judicial system where we're not having the death penalty, but we need to eliminate the death penalty. We need to be funding alternative responses, and many people have already talked about this on the call. I won't belabor that, but we need alternative ways of responding to what are now police calls. I ride a lot on Saturday nights with young police officers. I see what they're responding to, and a huge number of their calls are mental health calls, and we need alternative responses that are not by the police department and somebody with a gun, and we need to fund that.
Mayor Schul, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're.
Yeah. Okay. That's.
Just follow up on your final point, Steve, and Marianne made the same one. We did this call with the Triad a couple of days ago, and Greensboro is now 2 months into a program where when they get a mental health call, they send an officer and a social worker, and the officer establishes the scene, makes sure that everybody's safe and nobody's at risk of injury or harm. And then once that happens, they recede, and the social worker takes over and begins the intervention and tries to connect the person to the right service. So this is something that a lot of the cities in our state are beginning to wrestle with, and I'm sure you all, through Metro Mayors and other organizations, will share your best practices. And as you have experiences, please inform the task force, because we want to be making recommendations statewide. So the discussion was so good, I've exhausted my time, unfortunately, and I'll hand it off to Justice Earls to pick up the conversation from after the arrest is made and the court system is engaged. Justice Earls.
Well, yes, thank you. And Mayor Schul gave us a great transition point because some of the court issues have already come up. So I'm going to immediately turn to Attorney Randy Griffin to talk with us about courts and racial equity from your perspective. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Good morning. I actually was in Wake County this morning for court, so I apologize. I hope it's not too loud in the background. I just had some thoughts on the courtroom in the system. I'm a defense attorney out of Durham, North Carolina, and been doing this for about 20 years. And I've spent 17 years working on a court-appointed list. And some of the things I've found just going into the courtroom is just the total lack of minorities, is not a lot of representation in the minority community, the women, Hispanics, and African Americans. You don't see as many. We in the courtroom in some of these places, especially some of the small counties. I've been to court where actually deputies stopped me with my client and allowed my client to come through security checkpoint, being a white male, and told me that I couldn't come because if I didn't have credentials. And I've had to show my bar card and actually explain to them that, hey, I'm the lawyer and this is my client. But going into some of the courtrooms with the disparities, it can be discouraging for minorities, Hispanic males, African-American males. Sometimes even when we get to the point of jury trials, we see jury pools that have sometimes one or two African-American males, or maybe one or two females in them. And so it makes it difficult sometimes to get equal representation in that community for the clients, and that can be very difficult. You know, and so those are some of the things I've seen. I also wanted to reiterate, as far as like traffic court goes, the $200 late fee is very burdensome on a lot of the clients, because if they've lost their license for unpaid tickets, well, most of them tell me, look, if I had the money, I would have taken care of the ticket when I got it. So you're talking about a $200 late fee that the legislature has ordered on traffic tickets now, that you have that fee along for court costs is $190. So it's $400 for one ticket. Now, like in Durham County, I do have to commend Ms. DeBerry and some of the others for the work they've done. I know Wake has started being a little more flexible too, trying to help people get licensed. But that is one thing that I find that can hold folks down. If they're not licensed, they don't have ability to get a license. A lot of the jobs in North Carolina in this area, because the counties are rural and some of the places are so small, it's difficult for them to travel back and forth without a license. The bus system just doesn't work for a lot of them. And so to have these fees, you know, say a person has 4 tickets they didn't handle, if we're lucky and we can get them dismissed down to 1, you know, they may have $400. But if they are not dismissed, you know, you may be talking about 4 tickets at $400 a piece a person has to pay. That's $1,600. And a lot of people just don't have that kind of income a lot of times. So I see people who, you know, they're younger, they're not as wise. They get these tickets, they don't realize the importance of them. And so now at 25, 30 years old, they're coming to us saying, hey, I need to get my license back. I'm having trouble getting good jobs. I'm having trouble advancing in my work, and they have difficulty. So those are just a couple of things I see with the disparities in the courtroom and the challenges of minorities that, you know, I wanted to bring up for this panel to consider.
Great, thank you so much. It is really helpful to hear from someone who's in the courthouses all the time, and particularly the diversity of places where you are representing clients. So thank you. We have such a huge agenda. I'm going to go quickly to the bail issues, and we'll hear from Andrea Hudson. I just want to let everyone know we have the working group that's looking at bail has been presented with a proposal that would ask the Supreme Court to issue a general rule of practice that would put more emphasis on what our state law already requires, which is that a cash bond is supposed to be the last resort. And so modeled on the settlement, if any of you are familiar with the Alamance County litigation, modeled on that settlement, that's been a proposal. We've also heard in some of the other listening sessions that we should just eliminate money bail altogether. So bail issues are certainly ones that we've talked a lot about. And Andrea, if you could tell us more about your program in Durham and what your experience has been, that would be great.
Thank you for having me. My name is Andrea Hudson. Everybody calls me Muffin. I'm the director of the North Carolina Community Bail Fund of Durham. Bail itself should just be abolished. It shouldn't be reformed, because you can't train racism away. So it's always going to be harder towards people that look like me that are Black, because if we look at this system now, you have folks, Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans was accused of shooting a white person, right? And his bond was set at $1 million. And then you have a gentleman who was accused of shooting a Black man, and his bond was $150,000. So they both are accused of shooting someone, but one person was white, one person was Black, and the person who was accused of shooting the white person, their bond is $1 million. So the racial disparities is there. So if we're going to do anything about ending cash bail, we need to have, I don't know who's over the magistrates, because when I went to the court commission, you know, I was trying to figure out like who's over these magistrates. They do what they want, when they want. You know, I was held a couple of weeks ago with no bond for a misdemeanor. So there's a problem with our magistrates. So that would be the first line when it comes to bail. And then the judges is the second, because, you know, people see the judge after they see the magistrate. So if we can get those magistrates in order and get them together, we very well may have a whole different bail process going on. But in doing that, if I shot somebody, I'm being charged, and then they have to go to court and see what happens, right? I think that police should be held to that same standard because they're human. They put their uniform on. That's a job that they chose to do. And because they chose to do that job, they should not be allowed to kill people that look like me and look like my son and not have any ramifications for that. And I think that's why it has been going on for so long, is because they don't have any accountability. Excuse me. They don't even have accountability from their own officers. And I'm not for police, and I'm for abolishing. We can abolish the police and we can fund other things, because what was it before police, right? We had community. Community keeps us safe. You know, when the police were harassing me, my community came out and helped me. The police officers that were standing around, all they did was watch. So that's why I say there are no good cops. And I'm going to stick with that. Even though I know that there are some good people, they're not good cops, okay? Because when they put that uniform on, they change, because that uniform is embedded in white supremacy, and we know that. And that was what the Klan told folks, you know, become a police officer and join the military. And when you do that, you can do what you want to Black folks and get away with it. And we've allowed that to happen for way too long. So I think that we should definitely do something about that. Again, you can't train away racism. I put in the chat that we need to have oversight boards, but these oversight boards need to have subpoena power, and they need to be able to prosecute these police officers that are going rogue and doing what they want to do, and they're not protecting and serving. So if they're not going to protect and serve, then they should be held accountable for that. And last but definitely not least, I'm going to say Attorney General Stein, if you can free Ronnie Long. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to just follow up on one point that you made, because in the coastal listening session, we heard from a professor at UNCW who talked about restorative justice practices. And I'm curious if you have a view, as you talked about community keeping you safe, if you would want to comment further on the concept of restorative justice and how that might play into this.
Okay, so what I learned is through the harm-free zone, through Spirit House, is what accountability looks like for you. If you've caused me harm, as opposed to reaching out to the police, I can reach out to a community member and say, hey, I have an issue with Supreme Court Justice Earls. Is there any way that you can set up a meeting with us? And they will set up a meeting with us, and we will have a conversation about what I feel harm is to me, and what it looks like, of what accountability looks like for me. You know, I've had someone who hit my car, right? And I've only had to call the police because I had to file an insurance claim. But that person, they didn't have a driver's license. If I would have called the police while they were still there, then guess what would have happened? They would have went to jail, and that wouldn't have benefited them, because one, they didn't have the money anyway to get their license. Two, they wouldn't have had money to pay a bondsman to get out of jail. And at that time, the bail fund didn't exist. So we wouldn't have even been able to bail them out. So what does accountability look like for individuals? And as prosecutors, we never ask the victims what they would like to see happen. Like, you know, my brother was murdered in Durham, and the DA's office never once asked what, as we as the family would like to see happen. The DA office did what they wanted to do, and that man was allowed to walk free after killing my brother. So when people say, oh, you don't know violence, and what, I do, because my brother was killed right on Driver and Southgate in 2017. And so if the DA at that time would have asked us what we would have wanted, when that person asked for a plea deal, we would have said, give him the plea deal. But the DA was like, no, that's not a good enough thing. We're going to take it to trial. And took it to trial, and he lost it. So, you know, he's not in the DA's office anymore. But I always remember that. And every time I saw him in the elevator when I was going to court for someone else doing court support, I was like, you remember when you let the guy who killed my brother get away? I'm glad he did, because the work that I do now would have been advocating for him to be released, because there are other things that he could have done. If, you know, he would have been convicted, I've been fighting for him to get free, because I want to see people take care of loved ones. If you kill one of my loved ones, you should fill that void. Like, you should take care of his kids. You should pay that college fund. You should be able to buy that first car for that child. Those are the things that I would like to see happen to someone, as opposed to them sitting in a jail cell, because that's not benefiting them, because jail is not reformative. It's not rehabilitative. It doesn't do anything but make people angry. And when they come out, they get institutionalized. So it makes them want to go back, because the system is so designed for them to return. Because when you get out of prison, you got to pay probation fees. You got to have a job by a certain amount of time. And if you don't have all of those things, you go back to prison. So the system is not designed for people to stay free. It's designed for them to be free and then go back. And so, that's why they have the hashtag still not free, because as long as they're on probation or parole, they're still not free, because they will never be able to meet those goals and guidelines that the probation and parole office has set forth for folks, because we make it too hard for them, knowing that they've been institutionalized for 10 years. We say, come out, and you got to find a job in 30 days. You got to pay these fines. You got to take this drug test every week. You got to get here, you got to get there. But we give them absolutely nothing. We don't give them any mental health services. We don't give them any financial gain. When they leave prison, that money that was paid for them to be in prison, it should follow them home. If it costs $34,000 a year to house someone in a prison cell, that $34,000 should come back to the community with them when they come. And that way they'll be able to have what they need, and they're less likely to reoffend because they have the support that they need.
Thank you. You've really identified a number of such important issues. And just let me say, I'm sorry for your brother's loss, and thank you for sharing that, your perspectives and that experience. Let me turn to Keisha Millett from the North Carolina Justice Center and ask you to unmute yourself and share with us your perspectives on racial equity in the court system. Can you, Keisha, can you unmute yourself?
Good morning. Just want to apologize for some additional background noise that you may hear. My name is Keisha Millett. Can you all hear me? My name is Keisha Millett. I'm a staff attorney with the North Carolina Justice Center. I work on the Fair Chance team, and I'd like to speak today about fines and fees and incarceration. And so first, I want to commend the task force for your recommendation on assessing ability to pay prior to levying fines and fees. This issue is particularly urgent when we consider the following matters. One, that traffic stops are targeted at Black and Brown communities disproportionately, leading to higher rates of ticketing and increased likelihood of fines and fees being imposed on Black and Brown people. And there's recent traffic stop research that I believe was shared in the News Observer that helps to illustrate that even though overall traffic stops may have gone down, the number of, the rate of stops for Black individuals has increased. Additionally, court fees generally act as a tax on the user. So it's a user tax for people to pay for access to the courts, something akin to people having to pay to use the library, which when you think of it that way, doesn't quite make sense. Notably in North Carolina, these fees or court costs are not intended as punishment, yet they are mandatory. Generally, unless they are waived or remitted, and they cost hundreds of dollars, as people have mentioned, and recent state legislation has made it even more difficult to get these costs waived. And consequences can be heavy, such as indefinite suspension of driver's license for Chapter 20 offenses. So I recognize again that there have been some measures taken, but implore the task force to consider what additional steps can be taken to create more structural changes, particularly considering that the COVID-related extension for payment of fines and fees has ended recently, even though we continue to be in a pandemic and we have likely not felt the worst of the economic impacts. So again, recognizing that the heaviest impacts are already and will continue to be felt by those who are cash poor, what more can be done to address the issue with fines and fees. So this ability to pay determination is a really great start, but there's still need to work towards ways for judges to actually implement this effort and additional structural changes such that people are not having to pay a user fee in order to access justice. Another area of concern that really should be prioritized by the task force and has been raised by different folks that I've been working in coalition with includes sentencing and incarceration, as well as considering more with reentry. So race equity in the justice system cannot be actualized if the efforts stop at the prison gates. Research shows that Black people are disproportionately sentenced and incarcerated in our state prisons, and North Carolina prisons particularly are experiencing low staffing amongst their correctional and health staff. So we are in a crisis situation right now, recognizing that we are in a pandemic. And there are at least 7 state facilities, not including jails and other county level and local facilities that have COVID positive rates above the state percentage. My team has heard from many people who are incarcerated and their family members who are terrified for their lives, reporting that they are not able to social distance, that they do not have access to personal protective equipment, and that they're being placed in lockdown for 23 hours a day, which is ultimately a form of solitary confinement. So I would like to briefly share the words of a woman incarcerated at NCCIW who agreed to have some of her experience shared with us. So what she wanted to say is, I am appalled, aghast, and horrified for the lack of response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The posted precautions are a joke, and most are not even being followed. The bare minimum at most for those of us known as a menace to society. We are wives, daughters, mothers, and sisters, and most of all, human beings. So there's an opportunity now with this race equity task force to really recognize the humanity of individuals who are most impacted by the criminal justice system and to work towards ways to support change and even to be creative in thinking about ways to address the structural racism that exists. And not just at the point of policing or courts, but also going into the state prisons. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We are fortunate to have 2 of our elected district attorneys with us this morning. So I'm gonna go first to Lauren Freeman because she's there visually, and I'll go next to you, DA DeBerry.
Good morning. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I think it's, as I listen to the various comments, I think that the encouraging thing is that I think there are some things that there will be commonality about as we move forward. The district attorneys in this state take very seriously their responsibility of public safety, but also their responsibility to seek justice. And I know for us here in Wake County, when we think about public safety, part of the way we intend to achieve that is by ensuring that people can be stabilized successfully within our community. I'm lucky to be in a district where we have had deferral programs for over 20 years, and we were able to add some additional ones in the last 5 years, but we have very robust deferral programs here. And that is something that I think you could find a lot of agreement about across the state by district attorneys if the resources, the community resources are there to make those work. And otherwise, and as we've already heard today, those kinds of programs have to be paired with mental health treatment resources, substance abuse resources. The National District Attorneys Association is currently working on a catalog of deferral programs from across the country to use as kind of models to be stood up in various districts. I think there's a lot of interest in continuing to expand those types of programs. And I would encourage this group really to look at what other community resources are needed in order to make those programs successful in helping people overcome addictions and overcome other challenges that they might have. I think we all know that pretrial release has been a major issue of national discussion in the last couple of years. Wake County is proud to have recently been named a learning site by the APPR, formerly the MacArthur Foundation, to look at implementation of a pretrial assessment tool here and to review our bail policies, but also, when are we citing versus arrest? Again, I think there is some interest statewide from district attorneys in pursuing, looking at those. We are lucky in the Triangle area. While we all talk about the need for more resources, the truth of the matter is we have many more resources than many of the other districts across the state. So for example, here in Wake County, we have had a pretrial release program for over 20 years. I think the implementation of pretrial release programs statewide and the state funding of that is really important. I also think that, and I hope that this group will look at the availability of data as to who really is in our jails. The inconsistent and incomplete data county to county of who is sitting in our county jails makes some of the goals that we wish to achieve and ensuring that we are not wrongfully holding people who don't need to be there a challenge. And so that is an area that I hope this task force will look at. There are particular statutes that need to be reviewed. The one that comes to mind specifically is 15A 534 D3 that requires that a magistrate set a minimum of $1,000 bond if it is a case where a bond was not previously set and the person fails to appear. That statute needs to be changed. I know that there has been a lot of discussion also around mandatory minimums. I hope that this task force will take very seriously the history of this state and looking at structured sentencing. Truth in sentencing is very important when we sit down as prosecutors and talk to them about potential outcomes of a case. And so as a prosecutor, I urge you to be slow to turn back what this state enacted in structured sentencing. I think that for many of us, it is important to note that the victims that we serve, the vast majority of victims that we serve are also people of color, and making sure that we are able to give them a justice system that does in fact seek and obtain justice for them is critically important. And then just finally, in listening to Mr. Griffin, and I agree with him, the importance of increasing diversity within the criminal justice system in positions of influence. 50% of my hires since being district attorney have been people of color. I think we need to continue to train people within district attorneys' offices. The Conference of District Attorneys has offered implicit bias training and some other training, but the resources available to really bring about awareness and change in prosecutors' minds are limited. I recently personally paid $7,500 out of a campaign account to have a series of facilitated conversations within my office with experts in the area of racial sensitivity and equity and inclusiveness. And I really urge this group, I know that that type of training is something that y'all are looking at for prosecutors. I think it is critically important, but I think the funding to make it happen has to also be there. So those are just a few of the things that I wanted to share today. I appreciate the important work of this group. And I really hope that we will, resist the urge to paint with broad brushes the police, prosecutors, those in our community, and that we'll find a way to come to the table and talk and to find common solutions to this problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that time is very short, but I do want to ask you about one thing that has come up in other listening sessions relating to the district attorney's office, and that is charging decisions. We've heard from other offices that that's something that where discretion enters the system, and where because of our over criminalization, there's a lot of discretion, and that's where racial disparities enter, one of many places where racial disparities enter the system. And I'm just curious whether your office has any way of tracking that, and what your thoughts are about sentencing decisions. I'm sorry, charging decisions.
Right, certainly. I think in our district, most charges are initiated by law enforcement. There are some districts where they do what we call paper cases, where the district attorney will review charges in advance. I think that has to be a collaborative between prosecutors and law enforcement to ensure that we are charging what the evidence will support, and to also look at and to analyze the data to try and identify disparate charging practices. And I will say that as someone who has led court agencies in this state, first as the elected clerk and now most recently as district attorney in White County, I agree wholeheartedly with my colleague from Mecklenburg County, Spencer Merriweather, that the availability of aggregate data for district attorneys and others in the system is really lacking, and that it is very difficult to identify trends and therefore to correct them without that sort of easy aggregate data access.
Thank you. Let me turn to District Attorney DeBerry.
Good morning. Thank you. I've been asked by the task force to speak some on prosecution and restorative justice. And so I want to thank Muffin for really setting that up for this conversation. The punitive options that are offered by the traditional court process often fail to make victims whole or address the underlying reasons a crime occurred. Restorative justice allows us to do that. Restorative justice is a voluntary, victim-centered process that brings together people who've been harmed and those who have harmed them. Nothing happens until the victim has agreed that something will happen. And the goal of this is to try to repair that harm while holding the accused accountable and treating everyone involved with dignity. It is a long and difficult process, but the effects we found can be profound. We often hear from victims, and you heard this from Muffin this morning, that they just want to know why this happened to them or why the person chose them. Traditional court processes don't allow us to do that. Restorative justice helps victims get these answers. When someone is a victim of a crime, particularly a violent crime, that event diminishes their sense of control and safety. In a traditional court process, too often, all that we have to offer those victims is punishment for the defendant. Incarceration, while it may be warranted, is not a sufficient substitute for healing or meaningful victim services. Restorative justice gives victims back their power in these situations and helps them to heal and find some closure. The person who committed the harm must accept responsibility for their wrongdoing, face the pain they have caused, and actively participate in a process of making it right. This is the difference between punishment and accountability. Restorative justice is about accountability. We often hear that hurt people hurt people. Frequently, the victims and defendants in our cases have both been harmed and caused harm. All those nuances can coexist in a restorative justice process in a way that is difficult to do in court, and both sides can experience healing. Often, both parties come from the same community, and RJ brings that community together and to the table. Restorative justice can be transformative because people are given support, dignity, and intrinsic motivation instead of just criminal sanctions and collateral consequences. There's also research to back up what we've been doing here in Durham and what we've seen and heard anecdotally. Studies have shown that people who have been harmed and who go through restorative justice report being less fearful, experience less post-traumatic stress, and feeling more satisfied that they were treated fairly and that the outcome of their case was just. Research has also shown that people who do harm and go through restorative justice reoffend less often. They also perceive the process as more fair and some research has found that they are more likely to comply with restitution. So how are we using restorative justice here in Durham? In the past year and a half, the DA's office has referred 13 cases to community organizations for restorative justice. The cases referred have ranged from breaking and enterings to one homicide. Many of the cases referred are still pending because they take such a long time. Several have been wrapped up successfully with the repair agreement. Some have ended because of a party was unresponsive or no longer wished to participate. Often restorative justice is used only in low-level cases or in juvenile cases, but we've seen that a broader range of situations can benefit from it, either alone or in conjunction with more traditional prosecutorial methods. We're working to strengthen relationships with community groups that do restorative justice across culture and language and ethnicity, and create a process so that more cases can be referred for this type of disposition. At the end of this process, the parties agree to a repair contract outlining what the offender needs to do to make things right. This is guided by what the harmed person wants. Repair contracts have included that a person must attend counseling, work towards getting a job, further a passion such as art or cooking, or give back to the community through service or mentoring. In some cases, successful participation in restorative justice means a person will not be prosecuted by our office. In other cases, restorative justice happens alongside a formal court process and is considered in terms of that person's plea offer and sentencing. We are working with community groups to build our capacity to refer more cases for restorative justice. Outside of our office's involvement, restorative justice is happening community-wide in Durham. We see it in the misdemeanor diversion program that is run from the Criminal Justice Resource Center in collaboration with the Durham Police Department. Our schools are moving towards a more restorative process, and our community as well. Inside my office, the way that we have really embraced this as part of who we are is that we have an office book club. And one of our most recent book club selections was Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered, which I encourage everyone who's involved in criminal justice and in criminal justice reform to read, and Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr. So thank you for this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
I am respectful of everyone's time, but I can't conclude without acknowledging that we have also with us a member of this our state's parole commission. And I would love to just give you a couple of minutes, Commissioner Bryant, to tell us from your perspective how this task force can, particularly on the parole end, are there things that we can do to further racial equity from your perspective?
Thank you so much, Justice Earls and General Stein, my former Senate seatmate, and all of you all who are such important experts and players in the criminal justice system who I've been listening to. I just have a few thoughts thinking through what I've heard, and some reiterating what I've heard. And the first thing is, I know you all are already looking at data collection. One of the important things at a systemic level that is important in interrupting racial inequity is to have data and statistics that show where the problems are. And a lot of that data and statistics, like from our agency, we collect and report on what we're mandated to report on. And that's about all we can afford to do with the budgets we have. But if it can be determined what kind of racial equity statistics we want from justice agencies across the jail, like the DA Freeman mentioned, across the spectrum, like DA Freeman mentioned about jails, for example. And some of this may be low-hanging fruit in terms of collection and putting it in some kind of dashboard format where it can be looked at on an in-time basis, monthly, quarterly, whatever may be feasible. I would say put that at the top of your list of things you can easily mandate given your jobs and roles. That would be number one. Two, from the parole commission standpoint, one of the things by the disparities are baked in by the time we come into play, because we're on the release end of the court and judicial process. But the issue of mental health and substance abuse treatment and assessment and of housing for people who have been incarcerated would make a critical difference, could definitely shift the pendulum in terms of fair outcomes. And right now, be aware that mental health and substance abuse treatment is at a standstill because of COVID, but it was woefully inadequate even before COVID. But what we had moving for what we were building is all at a standstill. So that needs to be looked at and thought about in the short-term and long-term environment. That would be the second thing. The third thing, training. My additional career, in addition to my appointment at the Parole Commission, is a professional at diversity and inclusion and organizational training and a life experience in fighting racial equity. And I want to just emphasize to you that looking at intensive training, not just some one sign it off training that everybody gets and you do it one time in the lifetime or every 5 years or 3 years, but investing in some intensive training with ongoing support for some identified cohort of people throughout the systems. Because for all of us on the screen, our administrations are going to change, political agendas change, and we need to inculcate in these systems people with some skills to interrupt racism and oppression, understand how bias and prejudice works, what's happening inside us when one person would put that knee on the neck of another person and not be thinking about the humanity of that person. What is that internal process, understanding that and interrupting that and healing that. And I think there was a young woman who earlier said, helping people see what I cannot see or what we cannot see. And we need to know how to measure that in performance, to behavioralize those things that are bias reduction, that reduce bias in such a way that when we hire, evaluate, and develop our performance systems, those things are included. What gets measured gets done. If you can't measure it, it's not going to get done in a systemic way.
So I hate, I hate to cut you off.
That's all right.
But we are past our ending moment, and so let me just quickly turn over. Thank you, and I hope we can continue to work with you going forward. So let me turn this over to Attorney General Stein.
Anita, I'm going to do something you're going to get me mad at me, because I'm going to ask Angela a question. And Angela, you can keep it to 60 seconds because I do want to respect everybody's time.
Yeah.
Does the Parole Commission take into a factor somebody who's before them sentenced for a long period of time when the law may be changed that if somebody were convicted of the same crime today, their sentence would be substantially less? Is that a factor in when you all decide to grant parole?
It's a factor more often when we have, first of all, let me say, and I respect Attorney Freeman's point on sentencing, but the sentencing is so complicated that you almost have to be an expert to even understand it. So yes, when we have folks in front of us, often with lawyers or advocates who can point out that discrepancy and how it would apply, we take it into account. But frankly, across the board, in all kind of cases, our analysts are not, for example, told to provide us that information in that write-up of the case. It surely could be done, and that's something we could look at. And I wanted to mention that sentencing and how we issue warrants for violations and sanctions. There's no racial analysis of how that plays out and what racial disparities are happening in that process, as well as how we review our parole cases. It's very discretionary. Everything, almost all of what we do, is very discretionary. So that's surely an area for further exploration.
And data collection. Thank you for your comments. And Justice Earls, thank you. Briefly, just want to thank everybody. This was an excellent, excellent discussion. My one regret, I'm sure Justice Earl shares it, is we didn't really get to open it up to people to just chime in when they were so moved, but it was because so many of you as experts in your field had compelling things to say. We wanted to hear from everyone. To the extent you did not have an opportunity to speak and you wanted to, you can either comment in the chat room or go to the website, which is at ncdoj.gov/TREC, TREC. And that's true not only for people who are panelists today, but also anybody who's watching on YouTube. I mean, we want to hear from you about your experience and your ideas on how our criminal justice system can work better, because we all know that it can. Thanks so much, everybody, for your time.
Thank you.